Chapter 1: The Great Divide. The air was thick with the electric hum of the city, a perpetual pulse that seemed to echo in the veins of every person walking along the crowded streets. New York, a place where dreams collided with the harsh reality of survival, and where the divide between the privileged few and the struggling many had never been so stark. But that evening, something was different. A shift was in the air, unnoticed by most, but felt by a select few. James had never believed in destiny. It was a concept that seemed too abstract, too far removed from the gritty reality he lived. He had grown up in the rougher parts of Queens, far from the glitzy skyscrapers of Manhattan that seemed to be an entirely different world. The only future he saw ahead of him was one of constant struggle, a cycle of getting by and never quite reaching the top. Yet, somehow, despite his doubts and the endless obstacles, he always kept moving forward. But that night was different. James leaned against the cracked brick wall of a dilapidated building, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. The city was alive, its lights flickering against the darkness like fireflies trapped in a jar. He wasn't sure why he was there, standing in front of the old, forgotten warehouse near the docks. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of a time when this part of the city had seen prosperity. Now, it was nothing more than a place for drifters and the desperate to hide away from the world. But there was something inside the warehouse, something that had drawn him here. He had heard the rumors, of course. Whispers among the people who still clung to the forgotten corners of New York. A secret organization, known only as the Collective, had been operating in the shadows, pulling strings and manipulating events to fit their agenda. Some said they were a group of revolutionaries, others claimed they were nothing more than a group of anarchists hell-bent on chaos. No one really knew who they were, but everyone knew they were dangerous. James wasn't interested in the rumors. What mattered to him was what he had learned in the past few days, a message, a clue, something that connected him to this place. His heart raced as he approached the entrance of the warehouse, the door hanging loosely on its rusted hinges. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his breath. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. But even as he stepped inside, a strange sense of purpose filled him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was meant to be here. The inside of the warehouse was eerily quiet. The vast space stretched out before him, filled with shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He squinted, trying to make out anything that might stand out in the darkness. His footsteps echoed against the cold concrete floor, each one a reminder of how alone he truly was. Then, a faint noise broke the silence. A soft rustling sound, followed by a muffled voice. James froze, his instincts kicking in. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know that silence was not always a good thing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but low. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breath. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in all black, her face obscured by a hood. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her steps calculated and precise. James instinctively took a step back, his hand brushing the cold metal of the gun tucked into his waistband. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice soft but laced with authority. James didn't respond immediately. He studied her, trying to determine whether she was a threat or just another person lost in the city's underbelly. There was something about her, something that felt different. "I'm not here by choice," he replied finally, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "But I'm here now." "So, what is this place?" She stepped closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. "This is where it all begins," she said cryptically. "Where the future of this city, maybe even the world, will be decided." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what she meant, but something about her words made him uneasy. He had heard enough about the Collective to know they were not just some underground group, they were powerful, influential, and willing to do anything to achieve their goals. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice firm now. He didn't like being in the dark, especially when it came to his own life. Her lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing," she said simply. "But I think you'll find that your future is tied to this place now." James narrowed his eyes, taking a step toward her. "And what if I don't want anything to do with this?" She hesitated for just a moment before answering. "You don't have a choice anymore." And with those words, the world James thought he knew began to unravel, piece by piece. Chapter 2: The Invitation. James stood still, his mind racing as he processed her words. "You don't have a choice anymore." The phrase echoed in his head, but he couldn't quite grasp its meaning. He'd never been one for fate, or destiny, or any of that mystical nonsense. His life had always been a series of decisions he made to survive, choices driven by necessity, not grand plans or forces beyond his control. But now, here he was, in a dilapidated warehouse in the middle of the night, face to face with a woman who spoke as if she knew exactly how his future was going to unfold. "What's your name?" James asked, his voice steady but with a hint of suspicion. He needed something to ground him, to make sense of the surreal encounter. Her eyes, hidden in the shadows beneath her hood, seemed to gleam in the dim light as she regarded him. "Alice," she answered simply, her voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous. She was not just some random person in a hoodie. James could feel it in the air, the tension, the weight of her presence. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't anything like the people he usually encountered on the streets. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," he said, though there was no mistaking the curiosity that gnawed at him. There was something compelling about her, about this place. It felt like a trap, but it was one that he couldn't resist walking into. Her lips twitched into a smile again, but it was different this time, slightly more knowing. "It's not about selling, James. It's about joining." "Joining what?" She stepped closer, her movements fluid and almost predatory. "Joining us. The collective." She let the name hang in the air, as though it held more weight than the sum of its words. "You've been chosen." James felt the ground shift beneath him. Chosen? He had no idea what she was talking about. He had never been anyone's first choice for anything, let alone something as significant as this. But the way she said it, so matter-of-factly, made his heart skip a beat. Could he have been involved in something larger without even knowing it? He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to shake the feeling of unease creeping up his spine. "I don't even know who you people are. What do you want from me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and walked toward the far end of the warehouse, her boots making a soft tapping sound against the concrete floor. James followed her cautiously, though he had no idea why. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, with an air of certainty that made him think she had answers. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he knew this wasn't just any random encounter, it was something bigger. She stopped in front of a large, unmarked metal door. Her hand reached out, brushing over the cool surface before she glanced back at James. "Come inside," she said. "I'll explain everything. But be prepared to leave behind the life you know." James hesitated. The door seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, like it held the key to something he wasn't sure he was ready for. On one hand, he wanted to turn around and walk out of there, pretend none of this had happened, and return to the life he knew. But on the other hand, a part of him, something deeper, more primal, wanted to know what was behind that door. To understand what this was all about, to learn what the collective was and why he had been chosen. He wasn't sure why, but a gut feeling told him that this moment would change everything. And that was the last thought he had before he stepped forward. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit room on the other side. The air was cool, but it felt different, almost sterile, like a place meant for secrets. There were no windows, no signs of life, just rows of computers, flickering lights, and large screens lining the walls. It looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, sleek, clinical, and yet, it felt real. Alice motioned for him to follow her, and he did so without a word. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing him inside. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint hum of the machinery around them. "This is where the real work happens," Alice said, her voice calm but carrying an air of authority. "The collective is not just some underground group. We've been operating for years, influencing the world in ways you couldn't even begin to imagine. Our network stretches across industries, governments, and systems. We're the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes." James didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified. The idea of an underground society, controlling the world from the shadows, sounded like something out of a conspiracy theorist's wildest dreams. And yet, standing here in this cold, sterile room, it felt like the truth. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice quieter. Now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Alice turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Because you're different, James. You've got a fire inside you, a willingness to do what others can't. You've lived through enough to know how the world works, and you know how to survive. But that's not all. You're also ready for something bigger." James looked at her, unsure of what to say. This was too much, too fast. His whole life had been a series of survival tactics, of getting by from one day to the next. How was he supposed to join some secret society, change the world, and take on some grand purpose when he could barely keep his own life together? But Alice wasn't waiting for him to answer. Instead, she walked over to a console on the far side of the room and pressed a button. The screens in front of him flickered to life, showing images of different cities, people, and political figures, all linked by complex webs of information. "This is the future," she said, gesturing to the screens. "And it's ours to control." James felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer just about him, it was about something far greater than he had ever imagined. And as he looked at the screen, at the network of power and influence that stretched across the globe, he realized that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. Chapter 3: The Web of Influence. The screens in front of James pulsed with data, shifting from one image to the next, a living map of interconnected people, corporations, governments, and hidden forces. At first glance, it looked like a chaotic mess of lines and dots, but as Alice stood beside him, her fingers dancing over the console, it all began to make sense. Each line, each node, represented something, someone, within the vast network of power the collective had built over the years. "This," Alice said, her voice calm but unwavering, "is how we see the world. A web of influence. Every action, every decision, no matter how small, ripples out and connects to something bigger. And we are the ones who ensure that the right things happen." James frowned, trying to wrap his head around the concept. The idea of controlling such vast systems felt almost too abstract. He had always been a man of simple means, fighting for survival, fighting for his own place in a world that didn't care much for people like him. Now, he was standing in front of something far greater than he could ever have imagined. "Who are these people?" he asked, pointing to one of the images on the screen, a well-dressed man with a stern expression, standing in front of a government building. Alice smiled, her eyes lighting up with an eerie sense of purpose. "These are the decision makers. The ones who control the flow of money, power, and information. We keep tabs on them. We influence them. We make sure they do what's necessary for our goals." James shifted uncomfortably. "And what are those goals? What is it that you want from me?" Alice didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the console and typed something into the keyboard. The screen flickered, and a new set of images appeared, photos of impoverished neighborhoods, struggling industries, and fractured communities. "Power isn't just about controlling the rich and the influential," she said, her voice growing more intense. "It's about control at every level. The weak, the broken, they're just as important as the powerful. The collective sees potential in every part of society. We don't just manipulate governments or businesses. We shape the future by influencing every facet of life. Every decision. James stared at the images on the screen. The faces of people who had never known anything but hardship. He had seen their lives firsthand, growing up in the streets of Queens. The inequality, the despair, it was something he knew all too well. But he had never thought about it in the way Alice was describing it, as a part of a larger plan, a puzzle that could be controlled. "So, you want to change the world," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "But how does that involve me? What do you expect me to do?" Alice's gaze sharpened, and she walked toward him, her every step deliberate. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but not unkind. "You've been chosen because you understand the struggle. You've lived it. And you have the drive to fight for something more. You can see the cracks in the system, James. You know how to use them." James opened his mouth to argue, but she silenced him with a raised finger. "You can't ignore this," she said. "Not anymore. You've been part of this system for your whole life, whether you realized it or not. The streets, the hardships, the choices, it's all a part of the machine. But you have a chance to break free from that. To take control of your own future, and by doing so, influence the world around you." James felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always felt trapped. Like a cog in a machine he couldn't escape. But now, she was offering him a way out, a way to not just escape, but to take control of that machine. "But why me?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time. "Why not someone else?" Alice smiled faintly. "Because you're the one who's ready. Others might be too comfortable, too complacent in their lives. But you," she paused, as though choosing her words carefully. "You've been on the edge. You've fought for every scrap. And that makes you dangerous. That makes you valuable to us." James wasn't sure if he should feel flattered or disturbed. He was beginning to understand that Alice wasn't just speaking in metaphors. She was talking about real power, real control, things he had only seen in movies or read about in conspiracy theories. The problem was, it was starting to sound too plausible. And that terrified him. "You still haven't answered me," he pressed. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Alice's expression softened, and she walked back to the console, typing in a few more commands. A new image appeared on the screen, a detailed map of the city. It looked like any other map, at first, until the small red dots began to blink. The dots spread across the map, appearing in different neighborhoods, businesses, and even government buildings. "These are our targets," Alice said quietly. "People and organizations we need to either influence, control, or eliminate. You will be our eyes on the ground. You will be the one to make contact, to gather intel, and to manipulate the right people at the right time. Your job will be to infiltrate the system from the inside. To make sure that our plans move forward, unnoticed, until it's too late for anyone to stop us." James felt a rush of adrenaline shoot through him. This wasn't just a choice anymore. It was a mission. A dangerous one. But it was a mission that promised power, control, and a chance to rewrite the rules of the game. For the first time in his life, James didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he could become something more. Someone who had a say in the world, instead of simply being a pawn in it. "And what happens if I refuse?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Alice's gaze locked onto his, her eyes cold but filled with a strange certainty. "You don't refuse. Because if you do, we will ensure that you disappear. Not just from our lives, but from everything. No one will remember you. You'll be erased. So, make your choice, James. The world isn't going to wait for you to catch up." James swallowed hard. His heart raced as he weighed the consequences. But deep down, a part of him already knew what he was going to do. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. He was going to fight. He nodded, his decision made. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady. Alice's smile returned, this time more genuine, more approving. "Welcome to the collective, James. Let's change the world." Chapter 4: The Tipping Point. The days that followed were a blur, each one feeling like an extension of the last, a series of tasks, instructions, and strange encounters that seemed to blur the lines between reality and something far darker. Alice was his guide, the one who taught him the intricacies of the collective's operations, how to infiltrate the powerful, how to manipulate events without anyone ever realizing it. He had expected his life to become more complicated, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly it would evolve. He was no longer just a man living in the shadows of New York, barely scraping by. He had become something else, something more dangerous, more influential. It was exhilarating at first. The first time he successfully planted a piece of disinformation in the media, the way the news cycles twisted around it, how a public figure's reputation crumbled overnight, it felt like power. He watched the ripples spread, feeling a rush of adrenaline each time a plan came to fruition. But as time wore on, the weight of his new life began to sink in. The decisions were no longer abstract. Each mission, each piece of intel he gathered, brought him closer to a world he wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of. The people he was working for weren't the faceless conspirators he had imagined. They were real, and they were ruthless. One night, after a particularly long day of managing multiple tasks, feeding misinformation to corporate execs, securing key business partnerships, and manipulating political donors, James sat alone in his apartment. The city outside seemed quieter than usual, as if it too were holding its breath. He had just returned from a meeting with a high-ranking member of the collective, a man named Richard, who had been the one to orchestrate much of their covert operations. Richard had praised him for his quick learning, his ability to adapt to their methods. But something in Richard's eyes, something cold and calculating, unsettled James. It was the first time he'd truly realized how little room there was for mistakes in this game. There were no second chances, no room for failure. It was all or nothing. Sitting there in the silence, James couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had crossed a line. The work he was doing wasn't just about reshaping the system, it was about controlling it, bending it to the will of a small, powerful group. And that power, he was beginning to see, came at a cost. James' phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen and saw Alice's name. "We need to talk," the message read. He didn't hesitate. Within moments, he was on his way to meet her at a secure location, a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street in Manhattan. As he entered, Alice was already sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced calm of someone who never let their guard down. "You've been doing well," she said, motioning for him to sit down. "The collective is impressed with your progress. We've got a new assignment for you." James nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He could feel the tension building inside him, the questions he had avoided asking finally surfacing. "I want to know more," he said, his voice low. "What's the endgame here? What are we really trying to achieve?" Alice's gaze hardened, and for a moment, she didn't respond. She studied him, as though weighing the sincerity of his question. "The endgame is control," she said finally, her voice steady but full of intent. "We don't just want power for the sake of it. We want to reshape the world, to make sure that the right people are in charge. People who understand what needs to be done. People like us. The collective believes the system is broken, and we're going to fix it." James absorbed her words, but they didn't settle well with him. He had seen the corruption, the exploitation, the suffering that was baked into the system. But this wasn't about fixing it, it was about taking ownership of it. Alice leaned in, her expression softening. I understand your concerns. It's not easy to see the bigger picture when you're stuck in the middle of it all. But trust me, James. You're part of something far greater than yourself now. And when this is over, the world will be better for it. Her words were persuasive, but James felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He wasn't sure if it was doubt or fear, but the realization was clear: the more he learned, the less he understood about what he had truly become a part of. He looked up at Alice, his eyes searching hers. And what happens when we've reshaped the world? What comes after? Will we have a world worth living in? Alice didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. That's the question, isn't it? She said softly. We can't control everything, James. Not everything can be planned or predicted. But we can control who gets to make the decisions. And that's enough. James leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the choices he had made pressing down on him. The power he had so eagerly embraced now felt like a heavy burden, one that threatened to break him. As he left the cafe, the cool night air hit him like a slap in the face. He stared up at the skyline of New York, once a symbol of possibility, now a reminder of the world he had entered. There was no going back, no escaping this web of power and influence he had become entangled in. He had made his choice. But as he walked through the streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The world he was helping to create didn't feel like one worth saving anymore. The game had changed. And now, James had to decide just how far he was willing to go to play it. As the city lights flickered in the distance, he couldn't help but wonder, in the end, who would be the ones pulling the strings and who would be the ones left dangling from them.